Good afternoon, Sean here from Mountains Garage. Today's subject is big block Chevys. One that's always been near and dear to my heart. It's just something about when you open the hood and you see that giant valve cover, you wonder how it even fits. But they're actually packaged pretty well and will, for the most part, fit right in where a small block is, with a few exceptions. Well, let's talk about them. Starting with the Mark designation, M-A-R-K. The Mark 1 was the W motor, the 348, and the She's So Fine, My 409. That's Mark 1. They're still pretty popular. I've never had one, probably never will. The combustion chamber was in the block, I guess, which cut down on high RPM power, so they started almost immediately experimenting, and that brought up the Mark II. You probably never see one of those unless you're in a museum. I think Smokey Yunick had one at Daytona in February of 1963, the mystery motor. Mark III never happened. That was some kind of deal with Packard to use their machine tools and rights and all that stuff. Well, that's just a legal thing, never happened. Mark III doesn't exist. Mark IV, in late 64, they started production for the 1965 model year of the 396. Great engine. We'll get into that in a minute. As soon as the automotive press saw the crazy valve angles and stuff, they labeled it the Porcupine. Soon after, with the mouse motor, small block already existed, and this became the Rat. That kind of stuck. You don't hear the Porcupine very much, but with the big block, in a small block, all the valves are right in a row. Well, big block, they're headed every which direction, all for performance. Higher RPM performance, believe it or not, despite the fact it makes a ton of torque. They're always chasing more high RPM power. Before we start rattling off engines by cubic inch size, let's talk about the differences in the blocks. The passenger car block, we'll call that standard deck. A truck block, that'd be 366 and 427, are the only truck engines out there. The block deck surface above the water pump, and I'll show you in real life, is 0.400 taller. They used a 4-ring piston, and that's why it's like that. All Mark IV engines that I'm aware of, somewhere in the casting, the standard deck will say high perf pass, every one of them. It doesn't make it special, doesn't make it worth $1 million on Facebook Marketplace. That's just how they identified them. Every one of them, high perf pass. The truck motors, the tall deck, is cast in on the head and the block, truck. Nothing fancy, just the way they did it. Cylinder heads. You had a couple distinct varieties. You had oval port and rectangular port. That's the intake port. Description. There was different sizes of oval ports. From little peanut ports in the late 80s. When they started in 65, they were pretty decent size. They call those the large ovals. And they increasingly got smaller as the years went on. The rectangular ports, for the most part, are all the same size. Combustion chamber. They were closed chamber, a small chamber, up until late 69 in some engines, and definitely in 1970 they went to an open chamber. So the dome height of the piston is smaller. Your closed chamber dome is smaller than your large chamber dome if you have dome pistons. Crankshafts were either cast steel or forged steel. You can tell by a forged one has a wide parting line, and a cast crank has a thin parting line if you look at the center of the throw on the crank. Connecting rods, these either had 3/8 or 7/16 bolts. Most of them have 3/8. The high performance stuff had 7/16. So the 396, that's just got a nice sound. It rolls it off your tongue. Ask Bruce Springsteen. He had a 69 Chevy with a 396, but there's no such thing as fuely heads, Bruce. On a big block, still a cool song. I'm sure he still hears about that. Anyway, in 65 and 66, your 396 did have a rear, kind of strange, grooved cam journal, the last one back, and matching bearings, so you used to have to know that stuff if you were going to put a camshaft in it, but nowadays, I don't think anybody talks about that anymore. You can retrofit it, and so they all take the camshaft with all the solid journals on it. Great engine, and they were, again, available in lots of different horsepower varieties. That's how they broke them up. And in 1970, if you believe folklore, GM had a bunch of rusty blocks, so they went ahead and punched them 30 over. So from 70 to 72, they're 402s. And in the smaller cars, they never changed the SS396 was already a proven name, so they're not going to change that. But in the big cars, they call it the Big Block 400. Not to be confused with the Small Block 400, which also came out in 1970. So that's the way they did it. The 427 car engine, standard deck, is pretty rare. I mean, that's pretty much Corvette and a couple Camaros, Novas, maybe, Baldwin Motion, something like that. But that's a rare bird. Easy to make. You can make your own. And here's how. The 396 and 427 have the same stroke crank, 3.76. The 427 and the 454 share the bore size in the block at 4 1/4. So you take a 454 block and a 366 truck motor or a 396 crankshaft, you put it in the 454 block, you got yourself a 427. Use a 427 piston. It's that easy. However, if you already have a 454 block, you might just want to go ahead and use the 454 crank and make a bigger cubic inch motor, but the beauty of the 366 truck stuff, not much you can really rob out of that thing, but most of them had a steel crank, forged crank, whatever you want to call it, the stronger one. So you can make yourself a cool little motor. Sidebar for a bit, big blocks are heavy. They're about almost 220 pounds, or heavier than an LS motor with aluminum heads. And they're about 100 and something pounds heavier than a small block Chevy in cast iron. So while we're talking 427, they made an all aluminum 427. It was almost a $5,000 option in the Corvette, and I think the Corvette didn't cost $5,000. But seems like if you happen to be able to swing to buying a couple of those back then, you'd be sitting pretty right now. You could retire, because that'd be worth a lot of money. The 427 truck motor is worth finding. If you happen to run across one, it's not a deal breaker. You can make a pretty decent engine out of that just the way it is by using off-the-shelf 427 pistons and a .400 longer connecting rod, push rods, and intake spaces if you're going to run a tall deck motor in place of the short deck, standard deck. The 366 and then the 427 truck motors had a heck of a run. They went from the 60s, 366 all the way to 2003 or 4. 427 came in and out, but they're not completely useless if you run across one, just not as popular. In fact, the tall deck theory, if you're going to build a big block Chevy with an aftermarket block much above 470 something cubic inches, you're going to get into tall deck territory where it helps with the connecting rod ratio and blah, blah, blah. So they're not, they're sought after in some instances, and if you can build a pretty decent big motor out of a 427 truck block, most of them are 4-bolt, probably all of them, I don't know, and if you see one, grab it. The pinnacle of power happened in 1970 with the release of the 454. In the LS6 version, that was 450 horsepower. It never got any better than that. In 71, they changed the rating on the engine from gross to net horsepower and started lowering the compression, and there was a gas crunch, and things were headed downhill. But the old big block kept trudging along, almost in shame in the 80s, because after 73, you had the 366 and 427 truck motors, and you had a 454 passenger car standard deck. And they got, the peanut ports and got down to like 7.5 to 1 compression. But they just kept chugging. They always got the job done, and they're great. They came in 2 and 4 bolt variety, the 454 did, and you can still make something out of them, and they're still out there, relatively inexpensive. So the Gen 4, Mach 4, we're going to get into that in a second. The Mach 4 went from 65 to right around 1989 when the Mach 5, but wait, it's not Mach 5 because GM and Lincoln got into a little dispute over the name Mark, M-A-R-K, because Lincoln always used it. So GM started calling it Generation 5 big block. But everybody in the free world, in the aftermarket, they just called it the Mach 5 and the Mach 6. So Mach 5 got you a one-piece rear main seal. They messed around with the coolant passages a little bit on the deck surface. And they did away with the fuel pump because everything was throttle body at this point. I didn't see a lot of carburetors anymore. Early Gen 6s also didn't have a fuel pump boss, but then due to the problems created by not having it, especially in their crate motor program, people with an old Chevelle don't want to have to add an electric fuel pump because they have a carburetor. They started putting it back on, so you can find the Gen 6 with a fuel pump boss. GM really, started getting fancy in their crate motor program. You can now buy a 502. Heck of a motor. Do not confuse that, and a lot of people did, with the 8.1 496 cubic inch Gen 7, Generation 7. That's pretty much the LS version of a big block. It used almost the same computer. The firing order was changed. It's a different animal. It looks pretty familiar, but it's just not the same. So 496 or 8100, whatever you want to call it. And actually GM sold the rights to, I forget the name of the company, but they still make them for school buses, and they just call them the Vortec 8000 or something. It's the same 496 motor. And they're still out there getting 3 miles to the gallon, hauling kids around. So you're shopping for a big block, and once you get over the downright sexiness of it, first thing you ought to lay an eyeball on, the deck surface pretty much intersects the water pump right there. I mean, it's on the same surface. This is a standard deck motor. If it was a truck motor, you got 0.400 on just under a half an inch more of meat on the block. So there's quite a gap before you see the head gasket surface. Simple check. To run a tall deck motor on a standard deck platform, there'd also be some 0.400 spaces, or you can buy an intake specific for a tall deck. That's actually easier. Your push rods are 0.400 longer than your standard deck big block. And if you want to run off the shelf 427 or 454 pistons, you have a 0.400 longer connecting rod. And all it does is take up the space, and everything else fits. Actual fitment in the car, you probably won't have a problem with the headers. They're actually going up a little bit, which might actually give you more room in most cases. So for me, like I've told you in the past, my first car had a big block, and then I pretty much put a big block in everything I owned after that. Eventually, I collected them, but never really had a good one. That's the difference between an LS motor now, which is a good, they're all good, they're all race motors pretty much. They all got roller cams and aluminum heads and all the good stuff that small and big block Chevys didn't get unless it was a really elite ones that you never saw in real life. You come across a big block out now out in the wild, it's probably, at best a high performance car engine, but it still has iron heads and, flat tappet cam. They never got too exotic. Different worlds. I've decided just to love them all. I tried to give up on the big block and go LS. I never messed with small blocks a lot, but now I'm going to build a couple of those. I got a few big blocks now, and I love the LSs, so I'm just going to love them all. That's all I can do. You can't deny it. They each have their own place in this world. Yesterday I shot a video about big block Chevys, and it was all fresh in my mind. I'd just gone and bought another one. I was passionate about it. Probably one of the best videos. I'm pushing 50 videos in this first year, and I was pretty excited. This is one of the good ones I'd done. Trying to free up some space in my phone last night so I could transfer it around and get it on YouTube. I deleted some of it and then all of it. And I learned a valuable mistake because I do it all on my phone. My phone only has so much storage, and here I am doing it again, and I hope I did. I don't know. I'm going to watch it, and it is what it is, but yesterday's video that's now poof, gone, was a better one. Thanks for watching. I'll try harder next time.